Nora Hale arrives at a neighborhood karate class, seeking something small, movement for an aching back and a community after her lonely days as a seamstress. Gentle, shy, and slow to speak, she becomes the target of two arrogant black belts who joke and push until one night their bullying turns physical. When Nora responds, she moves with a terrible, precise violence that shocks everyone, including herself. As the dojo reels and questions assemble, a quiet investigation into Nora's past reveals fractures, a missing year, phantom scars, and a life she has tried to stitch into order. This is a story about identity and the bodies we inherit from our histories, about a simple woman learning how to be whole with the memory of teeth and knuckles, about a community that must decide whether violence defines a person or whether mercy does. Tone is cinematic, intimate, and morally restless. Nora counted stitches the way other people counted breaths. Her hands, practiced in small, patient repetitions, had the memory of returning hems and the habit of smoothing what needed smoothing. She sat in the back of the dojo, fingers laced over the cotton of her gi, and traced the path of those stitches with a thumb while Sensei Kenji moved through katas at the front. The studio smelled of floor wax and lemon oil, of sweat and old leather belts. Late afternoon light from the high windows fell on the tatami like a warm palm. She had signed up on impulse. The notice on the community board said, "Beginners class, all ages welcome." Nora liked the word beginner. It meant room to learn and no one expecting anything. Her life of straight lines and small repairs accepted that a seam could be undone and restitched. She had left her shop early that week, locked the door where her nameplate hung crooked, and walked to the dojo because she believed, in a way she couldn't explain, that something in her shoulders might loosen if she learned to move differently. Sensei Kenji had noticed her as anyone trained to read bodies would. He watched how her shoulders sat hunched, even when she tried to correct them, how her feet found the balance points behind the mat, even as her eyes kept returning to the low windows, as though guarding a sightline. He had nodded once, the briefest permission, and she had smiled back like a child whose hand is found and held. The black belts arrived 2 weeks later in a pair. They were not from the neighborhood. They came in with that easy arrogance of men who have had other studios applaud their names for them. Marco, broad, shouldered, tattoo down the forearm that curved like a river, had a laugh that filled the room and a smile for anybody who would back down. The other Tom, younger and wary, had a scab on his eyebrow and the habit of stepping too close. "You two are our advanced class for tonight," Sensei Kenji said, making them sound like guests of honor. He meant it to be gentle. The dojo was small, and the advanced class had a way of folding in the beginner's room when the bigger hall was occupied. Most nights the advanced students were focused, careful. These two seemed bored. "Perfect," Marco said, placing his palms on his hips and looking the room over like a man taking stock. His eyes landed on Nora with a small, almost invisible tilt. "We've got fresh meat," he said, and the corner of Tom's mouth lifted. Nora heard and looked down, embarrassed, both because she had been called out and because the phrase lodged itself like a pinprick at the base of her throat. She had learned, over the years, the economy of avoiding attention. Smallness was a protection. It let the world pass without demanding. The dojo, at first, swallowed the exchange with something like indulgent amusement. Other students laughed softly, then grew quiet when Marco and Tom proceeded to be demonstrative. They sparred with the quick, showy strikes of men who had trained their egos into the shape of a fist. They showed moves, turned them into performance. Marco's voice filled the room. He invited comments, people obliged, timidly, until the line between teaching and showing off blurred. On the mat, Nora's mind felt like wet fabric, pliable but stubborn. She repeated the kata as Sensei Kenji instructed. Her body found the small marks of balance the way her fingers found the grain of cloth. She could keep her breath slow and let the movement stitch into rhythm. But when Marco and Tom paired with others, their practice turned loud. They teased novices, deliberately pushing into chests with rubs of the shoulder, exaggerating as if a bruise were a compliment. Their jokes lingered in the space. One night after class, Marco lingered. The dojo finally reduced to the sound of the street beyond the door and the soft clack of broom on mat. He leaned on the wall where the posters of past tournaments sagged, and his gaze found Nora like a visiting cat. "You know," he said, "casual, most tight, lace people are full of fight. You look soft." The word had a weight in his mouth as though he expected it to flatten her. Nora wrapped the belt of her gi twice and let her fingers go still. "I don't want trouble," she said. The words were small, plain as the bread she bought and the hems she stitched. "Who wants trouble?" Marco laughed. "But some people." He took a step closer. Not aggressive, but testing. "Some people walk in here and have a storm in them." She shrugged. "Maybe." Tom shifted and made a comment that was louder, humorless. "You should try rolling with Marco. It'll show you what you're missing." His tone indicated he meant to see if she would flinch. Nora felt the room contract. The old, predictable motion in her hands. The thumb tracing an invisible stitch line tightened into something else that sounded like a memory. She recognized the sensation because fragments of it came to her, sometimes dreams, where hands moved without thinking, where sound simplified into the rhythm of impact and breath, and mornings when her palms ached as if they had held on to something too tight. She had learned to tie these things off, to place them in a box on the high shelf of her mind with the other oddities. The night she couldn't remember, the pocket of time that sat hollow. "No," she said more clearly. "I won't." Marco blinked. Tom frowned. The light in the dojo hummed like a held breath. "You're serious?" Marco asked, as though Nora had used the wrong key. "Yes." She tied her belt in a knot she had learned as a child, an old, efficient pattern. "Please?" Marco seemed to like the idea of a small thing that would yield. "All right," he said, a promise of mischief. "Next week, then, show us what soft looks like." The next week, the dojo was fuller. People had brought friends. The advanced students' showy sparring had been replaced by something like a test, and a quiet demand had settled over the mat's watch. Marco and Tom cornered the room in a way that boxed Nora in. They smiled like men who had rehearsed a scene at the expense of another's shame. They called to her, made the banter soft, edged but with an undercurrent like a wire. "Come on," Marco said, palms open in the most disarming gesture of invitation. "Let's see how tough you really are." Nora walked to the center of the mat, the floor vibrating with other people's footsteps. The dojo's mirrored wall reflected her image back. Simple white gi, loose hair tucked behind ears, the slight tilt of a head that always looked apologetic. She measured the distance between herself and the two men. She measured her own breath. In the first moment, she was careful, conservative. She moved the way she'd been taught. A basic blot, a measured step, a breath timed like a metronome. The men responded with flourishes and easy attacks meant to embarrass. Tom jabbed. Light strikes meant to test a novice's reaction. Marco's movements had showmanship. The kind that forms when a person forgets the point of practice is discipline. Then something shifted, a small thing. A sound like the scrape of a shoe on mat changed Nora's awareness. She could not explain why. The world narrowed in a way that made sound sharpen breaths, and the whisper of kimono cloth, and the slight metallic scrape of Marco's ring when he raised a hand. Her heartbeat routed to a precise rhythm. The motion of her hands was not a thought. It was an instruction that lived inside muscle, in tendon and bone. Her left foot stepped back with a recognition that came from a place not on the map of her recent life. The first strike landed, and all the air in the room changed. It was not violent in the crude way the men had been. Nora's movements were economical, clean. She moved without effort, a machine remembering a program. Her block became an off-center pivot that allowed leverage. Her fist, when it hit, found a small vulnerable point under Marco's ribcage. He gasped, the sound of breath squeezed through teeth. Tom lunged, reaching to help his friend, and Nora pivoted and used his motion to unbalance him into the mat with a hip throw that had a clinical neatness to it. Time stretched and collapsed. Students let out sounds of surprise, sharp, involuntary. Sensei Kenji found himself stepping forward, his posture an attempt at calming, but the scene had already been carved. Marco rolled and came up with a quickness that was more about saving face than dignity. He squared off, flushed with the shock of having been bested by the person they had considered soft. "Stop!" Marco shouted, not sure whether he wanted the struggle to continue or for Nora to be the one to stop it. The dojo had become a spotlight, microphones of attention trained on her. Nora didn't stop. It was not malice that pushed her, it was a flood of muscle memory and the presence of an old, practical anger that had the shape of survival. She moved like a woman who had once learned to keep herself alive with precise violence and had not practiced gentle variance. The first time the words came to her later, after the room had quieted and the men nursed their bruises and someone had called to the paramedics just in case, she learned that people called her brutal. It was a label offered by the news the next day, whispered through the neighborhood like a rumor that will not die. Brutal offered no nuance. But the word caught, it smelled of the fear of suddenness. For Nora, the reality was less simple. After that night, she woke with her palms sore, as if she had been carrying something heavy. She had to sleep with the light on because images drifted behind her eyelids, a hand pressed to a throat, the crunch of a jaw being moved, the precise way pressure changes a body. She could not find the seam between then and now. She had retained her old life outwardly. The shop remained, the hems were still turned and stitched, neighbors still came for mending. People paused by the window when she walked by, some smiled awkwardly, unsure whether to say the forbidden name of what had happened. Students at the dojo avoided her for a week. A thin silence, then returned piecemeal when the shock softened into gossip. Sensei Kenji, who had watched the whole thing, understood the dangerous edges in more than one way. He had fought in his youth. He had seen triggers in the eyes of new fighters. He came to her quietly one afternoon after class and led her to the small tea kitchen in the corner of the studio, where they kept green tea in tin canisters and bandages in a drawer. "You moved like someone who knows how to end a fight," he said, not judging. He poured the tea with a hand's ritual. "What do you remember?" Nora stirred the tea and watched the surface ripple. "Pieces," she said finally. "Flashes. Smells sometimes. A streetlight. 2 men on a porch. A name that isn't mine sometimes. I have a hole." She touched her temple like cataloging a wound. "Months that are blank. I don't know why my hands remembered." Kenji watched her without hurry. Memory lives in many places. Muscle remembers what the mind doesn't want to. That is not rare. It is dangerous for you if you don't understand it, but it is also a fact that may keep you safe if you learn to guide it. "Guide it how?" she asked. The question felt childish. "With discipline," he said. "With learning the difference between force and anger. With finding the reason the body knows what it knows." He looked at her a long moment. "I can teach you if you want." Slowly. "But you should know, not all who bring violence to their past are monsters. Many are just people who survived." Nora took the tea and warmed her palms around the cup. She could not say whether she wanted to learn. Part of her recoiled from the efficiency of what her hands had done. Another part recognized how clean and familiar those moves had felt, like a morning ritual of teeth brushing. In the seam of those two feelings lived the restlessness that had dragged her to the dojo in the first place. Outside, in the street, a neighbor's child ran by, trailing a kite. The city had an ordinary rhythm that continued regardless. Some things could not be paused by revelation. The black belts were quieter after that. Marco's laugh lost an octave. Tom's jokes thinned like paper that had been ironed too long. Both of them began to attend another studio, uptown, where the class fee was higher, where the sparring had more flash and less realness. Rumors said they'd gone to test themselves in tournaments, whether their leaving came from embarrassment or a desire to learn properly. Nora did not want to speculate. She wondered about their choices the way she wondered about taut threads. Eventually, one must measure the wear. The thing that haunted her the most came not from other people's mouths, but from the long, looping gaps in her own biography. Before the dojo, she had been content in a small life. The shop had been a safe harbor. She mended the world in small measures, but she could not ignore the blank year that lived like a missing panel over the back door of her life. There were photographs she had no memory of taking. A scar on her forearm that she did not know how to explain. A handful of old receipts in a shoebox with names she could not match to faces. The more she stitched around the blank, the more fabric she pulled away from other seams. Lena, who ran the local community center and had become an unassuming friend, took to bringing her tea and patient questions. Lena had the hungry directness of a person who believed in small kindnesses as armor. You could go to the clinic, Lena suggested, the first time she mentioned more than small talk. They help with memory. Sometimes it comes back when you give it a place to be. Nora had resisted. "What if I don't want it back?" she said. The question surprised her. It was honest, like a raw seam. What if the person who remembers is someone I don't like? Then you get to decide what to do with them. Lena said, practical. You're not the first person to be surprised by themselves. You won't be the last. There were nights when Nora would undress and stand in front of the mirror and watch the woman who looked back. She was not physically imposing. She had the soft hands of a seamstress and eyes that did not like confrontation. Yet the hands, which had always been work hands, had become tools of a different sort. She thought about the men who had looked at her like she was an animal to be prodded. She thought about the flash of control when the mat had been her world and the strangers her problem. She wanted, in a quiet place, to put a name on what she had done. Brutal was one word. Survivor might have been another, but both words felt partial. The best she could do was start to explore. The investigation into her own past began slowly. She went to the clinic, as Lena suggested. The neurologist, a woman with a voice that was both steady and like, who had a habit of explaining things like sewing patterns, told her that trauma could splinter memory and lock it away. Nora listened, interested and worried, and agreed to the cognitive testing. She sat through hours where they asked her to trace shapes and remember lists and tell stories from pictures. For some tasks, she did nothing special. For others, the ones that asked her to remember sequences of moves, she excelled in a way that surprised both her and the physician. You have an exceptional procedural memory, the neurologist said. That means your brain stores actions well compared to episodic memories of events. People who have trained a lot in movement sometimes show this pattern. It can also be a protective adaptation after trauma. Does it explain the violence? Nora asked. It can. The doctor said carefully. If your body learned to respond to immediate threats in a way that bypassed narrative memory, you might not have the episodic recall of the events, but your muscles will remember the motions. Nora understood, then, that she had acquired a muscle biography and a memory that lived in breath and tendon. It made the world both stranger and kinder. Stranger because it placed the unknown in the place where her hands met the world, kinder, because it offered an explanation that did not make her a monster. As the months passed, the neighborhood's interest cooled. People began to see her on the street and smile the way one might smile at the survivor of a storm, respectful, slightly careful. The dojo became, for Nora, a lab for learning how to walk the boundary between force and will. Sensei Kenji taught her to slow down, to let her movements carry intention rather than reflex. He asked questions more than he offered answers, and that made him a map with generous margins. You could say Nora learned to control herself. It was more accurate to say she learned to account for the self she had been given and not to be defined by it. Then, one evening in late spring, the past walked in on two legs. The rain had come hard that afternoon, drumming the city's roof like a blanketing hand. The dojo's lights made islands of warmth in the growing dusk. A man came in just as the advanced class was finishing sequences. He did not look like the men who frequented the place. He was neither young nor particularly athletic, but there was a presence in him like a coil, not undisciplined force, but the knowledge of when to tighten and when to release. He carried no bags, only himself. He waited by the tea kitchen as if it were a familiar station in a trip, and when Sensei Kenji approached him, polite and watchful, the man smiled in a way that made the room colder. Not hostile, but like the small breeze before a storm. "I heard you had a woman who could keep herself," the man said. His voice had a clarity that made Nora's skin prickle. "She is a member?" Kenji said carefully. "We all learn here." The man shifted his weight. "I don't want trouble. I just wanted to see." He said it as though seeing were part of a business transaction. Nora's mouth went dry. Something in the man's eyes had the shape of a memory that did not belong to her current life. A scar along the cheek that turned into a small crescent, an expression of amused cruelty. The man introduced himself as Victor. He wore a coat that had been somewhere cold and dangerous. "Do I know you?" Nora asked, uselessly. Her heart beat quick, myopic, like a bird in a cup. Victor's mouth twitched. "Maybe. Names change. Faces, sometimes. But you have a presence about you that reminds me of an old debt." He did not wait for more. He stepped onto the mat like a man who had once owned rooms. He moved for a moment that seemed like greeting, then without warning, he lunged like a wolf with a collar. The room compressed into the discipline of motion. Nora's body did not choose, it responded. The lessons she had been practicing became a language she could speak with intention now. Her hands moved to deflect, to redirect his weight. She hit with a knowledge that pierced bone, precise, efficient. She did not want to destroy. She wanted to stop him. Victor, however, had expected the subtlety. He tested her like a man measuring a blade against resistance. The fight became a conversation between old echoes. He hit and she responded. They exchanged a sequence of movement that was both choreography and confession. As the duel lengthened, it grew less about the immediate and more about the claim made across time who belonged to what violence. At one point, Victor caught Nora off balance and slammed his elbow into her side. Pain like a hot wire lanced through her ribs, and for a second everything went slow. She tasted salt and iron and the memory of other rooms. She found the breath and pushed, and then everything snapped into a clarity that was not cruel so much as resolute. She moved in the line of least harm, a lock, a twist, a placement that would break his surge without maiming him. Victor hit the mat with a sound like deflation and lay there, stunned. The dojo held its breath. Nora, her chest heaving, looked down at him. She did not feel triumphant. She felt hollowed out, like a seam that a blunt needle had pulled through. Victor, panting on the tatami, smiled as if he'd been expecting this. "You remember now?" he asked when he could speak. Nora's hands trembled on the G. She did not remember the man. There were snapshots that might have matched him, a door in the dark. His voice in a room that smelled like gun oil. but they were like Polaroids gone soft. "I don't know you," she said. It was the smallest lie. Victor's smile sharpened. "You don't have to know my face to know your own hands." He reached up, fingertips trembling like a plea and then a claim. "You were good at keeping things quiet." "Why are you here?" Nora demanded. The words were steadier than the keening knot in her ribs. Victor laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Business," he said. "A settled account. People don't stay small forever. They fall into habits, then into debts." He looked at Sensei Kenji, who had stood beside the mat like a watchman. "But I don't need what you're holding. I just wanted to see." He stood up slowly and walked out into the rain. After he left, the dojo could hardly contain the noise of its startled sympathies. People gathered around Nora with water and towels and voices that meant well, but fussed too much. Lena came and took her by the elbow and led her out to the cool street. "You okay?" she asked. Nora leaned against a lamppost and felt the city's wet breath on her face. "I thought I might have to fight more than a man," she said. "But I didn't. Not yet," Lena said. She was careful with the word. "He was looking for something. You said he asked if you remembered." "For a second, there was a room I couldn't name," Nora said. "A corner of my head where a light was off. Maybe you didn't turn it on." Lena said softly, "Maybe it was already on and you couldn't see." They stood in silence for a while, the rain slowing to a trickle. Nora felt the vintage of her life change, like the turning of a dress pattern. The fight had not ended anything. It had simply suggested other chapters. In the following days, Victor's appearance rippled through the parts of the city that preferred to bury such things in polite silence. An old acquaintance from a shoebox of receipts called and asked if Nora remembered him. She said no. A man who said he used to know Victor's brother sent her a message saying she should be careful. Nora read it and then folded the paper into a neat square and placed it on the kitchen shelf with the rest of her small, orderly things. But she could not fold the feeling entirely away. The presence of Victor had made some kind of claim. People who had eyes for patterns, Sensei Kenji among them, saw that Nora's muscle memory was a fuse that could be lit by the wrong person at the wrong time. If she did not put boundaries around it, violence could call itself into being as easily as a bell summoning a herd. She decided, finally, that the only real way to know what the past would do was to meet it on her own terms. She wanted to find the missing year. She wanted to make the holes into seams she could work on. It was not about justice as much as mapping. The aim was not revenge but knowledge. The search was not cinematic. It involved a heap of small tasks, looking up shelter records, visiting the municipal archive, checking dates on photographs that had no faces she could name, speaking with the neurologist about memory consolidation. She found a photograph in a clinic file of a woman who looked like her but older and harder. In the picture, the woman's knuckles were swollen and there was a chain of bruises like islands across her forearm. She learned that for a period. Some years back, there had been protests in the city, small and then larger, that turned ugly in places. Police records showed arrests, names changed, the confusion of bodies moved through stations. She could not place herself in any of it with certainty, but the edges began to line up, a shaved head in a candid photo, a receipt from a bus that had routes to a precinct, a name of a place that had been a shelter and then shuttered. None of it was a clean line. And slowly, as months in training shaped her, Nora came to accept that her body had learned the clean language of survival in a time she had been given to survive. Muscle memory was not moral, it was adaptive. The question remained what to do with it. She realized, allow the label, brutal, to drift across her like a cheap shawl and let the world define her by a moment. Or she could take the tools at her hand. The measured discipline of karate, the slow, steady teachings of Sensei Kenji, the kindness of Lena. and use them to craft a new scene, one that accepted what had been done and what she had done, and chose, with knowledge, how to move forward. One night after practice, she stayed late, alone on the mat. The studio was washed in the gold of the setting sun. She moved through kata slowly, feeling the way repetition carved muscle into poem. Her movements were precise, not because she sought to be an instrument of harm, but because precision was a way to be present. She thought of Victor and the way his smile had folded the room. She imagined, absurdly, that violence was a language and she had to learn how to speak it without using it. Sensei Kenji came by and sat on the mat opposite her. "You have a choice," he said. "You can let your past be the script you follow, or you can write your own on the same paper." "I don't know how to write it," Nora said. "Then start small," he said. "Teach someone. Put your hands to something other than defense. Mending is not less noble than fighting. It still takes skill." She thought about the hands she had used for fighting and the hands that had once been full-time menders. The dichotomy was false. Both acts required attention. Both could keep people alive in different ways. It finally seemed possible to bridge the two. She did not become a saint. She could not erase what had happened, but she began to teach at the dojo's community outreach program, where kids from the neighborhood learned balance and not hitting. She taught them to respect reactions and to use movement as an expression rather than an erasure of fear. When a boy in class mimicked the arrogance of Marco and the dojo became a stage of little egos, she would step in with a quiet correction, a taut bypass for aggression. Her voice was seldom loud. It was the kind of voice that could hold a child steady. Months later, Victor came back again. He stood at the door like a shadow of a storm, and the room felt the temperature drop. This time, Nora was not surprised. She had been training more than just her body. She had been training the space inside where the past could be held without taking control. Victor's smile was the same as before. "You learned something," he said. "Yes," Nora said. She did not sound proud. She sounded resolved. "I learned not to be a weapon for someone else's hunger." Victor's eyes flickered with something like annoyance. "You could be useful," he said. "You and your hands." "I don't want that," she said. He moved as if to test muscle memory on his side. Nora did not meet violence with time-honed brutality this time. She met it with a sequence of blocks and holds that used Victor's own impetus to unbalance him. It was fast, certain, but not designed to injure. She caught him and made him stay on the mat, unhurt but contained. Victor's jaw set. He could have made things worse. He was known for that. But whatever plans he had, the cost had shifted. Nora's presence changed the equation. The men who had once been the biggest threat in her life, or who could have grown to be, had been reduced by the simple fact that a city was not a theater anymore. People watched, and something about the collective gaze made predators think twice. Victor left that night not with a grin, but with a consideration like defeat. He walked out and into the rain again. Nora watched him go. She did not feel victorious. She felt fragile and steady, like a patchwork quilt, bound and soft. The past had not been erased. It had been acknowledged and then set in a frame. When people asked her about that night, and the one when the black belts came, Nora told the truth as she could be. She had been surprised by what her own hands could do, and she had learned, slowly, to choose how to use them. People called it bravery, Nora called it habit, and habit changed by intention. One afternoon years later, when the kids she had taught grew into teens who called her by a nickname, Nori, she found Marco in the dojo again, not with a sneer, but with the careful humility of a man who had been humbled by age and honesty. He came to apologize for the nights they had mocked her. He had fought in tournaments and lost enough that his laugh had become smaller. "I'm sorry," he said, in a voice that did not want to be loud. "I thought I knew what strength looked like. I was wrong." Nora looked at him. She had no interest in revenge. She had, in the quiet of that afternoon, what she had wanted all along: the knowledge that her body could be trusted to choose when needed and to rest the rest of the time. "It's okay," she said. "We all learn." He smiled, grateful, and left without asking for anything. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Nora went back to her shop and sewed. She took an address and altered a life the way she had always done. But now, when the stitch pulled taut and the thread ran clean, she felt a new thread inside her own hands. It had been refined not by violent necessity, but by the slow practice of choosing. She had been a simple woman, unremarkable in the ways the world catalogued, and she had been violent when she needed to be. She had been brutal by the dictionary's definition, but the word had stopped being enough. What kept her was not the memory of a fight won or of an enemy bested. It was the knowledge that a person can inhabit two truths at once: the hands that mend and the hands that once protected, the small kindnesses and the hard lessons. She had been buffeted by storms, and she had learned to read the wind. The dojo remained a temple for that reading, a place where she taught, sat with Sensei Kinji for tea, and smiled at the kids when they imitated the peculiarities of their teacher. On quiet evenings, Nora would instruct a child in the rhythm of a kata and then return to her sewing, fingers finding hems and the small joy of making something whole. Sometimes, she would press the heel of her hand to the place on her side where Victor had landed his elbow and feel a tiny ache, a token of what she'd survived. It did not define her. It was part of the fabric. The world, like fabric, sometimes tears. People like Nora stitch it back. They do not always choose what stitches they have in their hands, but they can choose the pattern. In the end, the simple woman who had been threatened in a small room of light and wax and lemon oil became exactly that: a woman who remembered the brutality and had learned, with stubborn humility, to be otherwise.